Welcome to In Conversation with writer and editor Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life, a monthly chat with writers, publishers, and those who support the literary arts. Today, she is talking with John Pierce about his work as an editor of both poetry and nonfiction manuscripts.
Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to the program In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we have John Pierce in the studio with us. He's a freelance editor and tech writer. His clients include the Seattle Art Museum, Microsoft Press, Copper Canyon Press, and Rick Steves Europe. He lives in Chimacum, and we are delighted that he'll be speaking with us today about his work in editing, including being a volunteer editor for the Floating Bridge Press, a Seattle press that forwards the work of local Washington State poets. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks for inviting me. Nice to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. I am so interested in hearing from an editor. I think that all of us as writers know we need them. We know they're there, but we have our struggles. I know in my own writing life, I have learned an incredible amount from having my work edited, and yet I still hear lots of people say, oh, I hated what the editor did. I wouldn't let the editor do this thing. Oh, the editors are so slow getting back to me, all kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. And also editors are kind of invisible, so it's really easy to gripe at them because they're not very visible. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of the issues for you as an editor working with writers.
Well, sure. I mean, they cover a wide range. And I guess I would say that, most experiences with the authors and the writers I work with are very compatible and very collaborative, and really very few issues arise. And generally, it's because when you are reading, you've even been prompted by, say, a project manager, something like that, or in your own experience, an essay you're editing. Specifically, I think most of the time I'm working on expository writing. Just doesn't quite meet the bar for the project you're working on. And so sometimes from time constraints or just distance, or again, sort of instructions that you're following necessarily by, say, your client, something like that, you really dive in and perhaps just edit a little bit, more deeply than the author anticipated. And you don't have a lot of opportunity to set up the level at which you've edited. And so the writer is going to respond perhaps negatively because, he or she is thinking that they did a good job, and they're very surprised at the extent to which you have changed their text.
So what's interesting is the writer probably thinks they're the client, but to the editor, the press is
precisely,
the client.
Exactly. And so, you really are responding to the publisher's outline of what's deficient in, say, in the text, or what really needs attention, that sort of thing. And they've engaged the author. They may have a history of the author that predates your involvement in them, so that they, perhaps the publisher or an acquiring editor at a publishing house, something like that, has already gone through several rounds with authors. And so they may be just turning it over to you as a manuscript editor, copy editor, saying, I've done as much as I can, you take a whack at it. And they're still, when you are done, the author is dissatisfied. I would say well above 50% of the time, the authors I work with express great appreciation. It's not that you don't go back and forth about certain things. Working with a couple of authors now who, I would prefer to say do certain things just because they seem more in the vernacular, that sort of stuff, but they're writing a very technical book, so they want to use language from time to time that they're very used to from the workshops they hold, from the clients that they talk to, from their colleagues. And so that's part of the terms of art in these days. And even if they may not sound as friendly to my ear, it's what the authors would like to say.
So do you find yourself in the position of going to bat for the author sometimes?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, many times a publisher will say something like, we're not quite sure that this is accurate. You do fact checking, or you actually do present a case working with the author of why why the subject matter has been covered thoroughly. So yeah, you certainly do that.
So does this being in the middle ever drive you crazy?
Well, I can't say that it does. I mean, I guess I actually think that that's part of what makes the editing interesting, because even though it may seem sort of routine from time to time, but every time you start a new project, you're starting working with a different set of personalities, and you're maybe applying your skills very similarly, but what you're going to discover is always going to be brand new. So I think You hope that you don't end up worrying and spending more time about the personalities involved than in what you are actually editing. But I don't really ever feel that I'm too much in the middle.
All right, that's good. You must have the right temperament for your job. So, I say the word editor, but really and just from listening to you, I'm reminded that there are all kinds of editors.
Yes.
So maybe you could tell us about just what they're called. And I know that in any one job, you probably wear different hats, but let's hear what editors do.
Sure. I'll name at least a few. And again, the center of American publishing is certainly New York, and trade publishing houses are organized much differently, say, than some of the smaller companies or the technical publishing houses that I've worked in. But in general, I think you can say that there are what we might call acquiring editors or acquisition editors who are going to be actually, working with authors from the very beginning. They'll identify market opportunities. They may be reading manuscripts that are submitted by agents, by authors themselves. They're really, at the very beginning of the process by acquiring books that a publisher is going to publish. And they may or may not spend an awful lot of time beginning to shape the manuscript. They might work with authors over several rounds. They might actually develop a book from an outline, from a single chapter, that sort of thing. So they really begin at the very early stages. And some of that might be also classified as developmental editing. But I think that's actually even probably a little bit different class than acquisitions editing, because developmental editing is not as much the business side, whereas acquisition certainly has a lot to do with the publishing business. But developmental editing is then going to be really looking at the whole organization of a manuscript from throughout 10 chapters, but with a whole book, but also within each chapter, each section of a chapter, that sort of thing. So that's really going to be trying to figure out whether shaping the manuscript in a way that it meets the target audience, meets the publisher's expectation, holds together coherently. If you're doing fiction where there's character development, plot development, setting, all that sort of stuff. If it's a technical book, that you're really substantially covering the subject matter. And then you have, say, copy editing, manuscript editing, where you really get down into the nuts and bolts of the sentence, paragraph level, lots of line editing, that sort of thing. And then also you're going to have proofreading at the very end, where you're actually making sure there's no typos and the book is ready to go.
Tell us about what line editing is as opposed to proofreading.
Well, I would say line editing takes place generally before proofreading. Line editing is going to be the application of style conventions, say like the University of Chicago Manual of Style. It's really working in a manuscript that's not yet been formatted, not yet been composed into pages. So it's still fairly early. And proofreading generally takes place after a book in the book world, or in articles, that sort of stuff, after an article has actually been laid out with illustrations, say, that sort of thing. So you're not just looking at the text, but you're looking at the whole page and how the book is presented.
So in line editing, you're looking at grammar and tightening sentences?
Absolutely. Grammar, tightening sentences, consistent style, all those sorts of things. And it's very much the application of style, consistent vocabulary, grammar, punctuation, other style conventions, that sort of thing.
So some of that might be caught in proofreading as well. Using a homonym.
The proofreader is copy editor's best friend, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I have done a lot of proofreading, and I've done lots of copy editing. I continue to do both and enjoy both. But proofreading is certainly, you want to have covered all as best you can by the time someone proofreads something. You hope that the copy editor has done a good job of applying consistency. But proofreading really has a great deal to do with making sure that the whole book apparatus is in place, or in a magazine, say, the layout. So it's not just typos again, but it's even column length in a magazine article, something like that.
So we've had acquiring editors and developmental editors and copy editors and proofreaders.
Yep.
And what about contributing editors? What are those?
Well, that's probably a little less of my experience. A contributing editor, I would guess, is my experience would be more in the periodical world, where from time to time a contributing editor will be writing a magazine article for a publication, perhaps speaking to authors to commission articles in a particular field. Contributing editors often have a sort of a area of expertise, art, literature, history, politics, that sort of thing. So in a general purpose magazine, they may be looking for articles in the subject that they concentrate in.
So kind of an expert seeking material. One of the things that's very interesting about your bio is that you have a variety of kinds of clients, and a kind of on the one hand, tech writing, travel writing, art writing, and on the other hand, poetry. Copper Canyon Press, being a volunteer editor for Floating Bridge, and I know you've done that for a number of years. I don't know that too many people can switch from the technical to poetic. Tell us about that, how that works, how you got started doing both. Or was the poetry something that got added in, or was that from the beginning?
I came to editing poetry after I became more of a editor of technical material. I mean, my first experience as an editor was mostly with books about art history, visual arts, that sort of thing. It's where I proofread, started copy editing, that kind of thing. My first stint as a freelancer back in the 90s, I started working for Microsoft as a contractor and really discovered an affinity for the kind of precision that technical language lends itself to. And I enjoyed let's just say the rhythms of procedures, the need to really be technically astute and clear in the expository language, that kind of thing. And it was something that I had some interest in computers as well, although I wouldn't call myself a geek at all. But, it was just a subject matter that really kind of just whetted my appetite to learn more. And then I had a wonderful opportunity and a great period of time when I was working for Microsoft Press, where I obviously specialized in books of that nature for a number of years and wrote some as well. So that was a great experience. My interest in poetry really turned when I started volunteering. I mean, I've always liked poetry as an English major. I mean, that's what I studied in school. And then when I had an opportunity to join the editors at Floating Bridge Press, that was just a nice chance to expose myself to more local poetry, begin to work for a small press, which is something I believe in. That's really nice to have those small publishers still working on behalf of niches like Washington State poetry and that sort of thing. And, I did contribute to those books as an editor. And then really, I would say that once I began a freelance career again in the late 2000s, I just sent a letter to Copper Canyon letting them know that I was living in the neighborhood and would enjoy working on their books. And by good fortune, I began to. And so I've been working for them steadily. And they obviously have a wonderful reputation. It's a great joy to work on their books at all levels. And you really have to learn a lot to be a good editor of poetry because it's a very sensitive language. You have to give the poets a great deal of license, as the saying would have it. But you also really have to be very astute in what you suggest needs to change.
That is something that's so interesting to me because we don't think about poetry being edited. And as a poet, I know that there's a lot of input in writers' workshops and in writing groups. A lot of attention is paid to word choice and unnecessary words.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you're listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, she is talking with John Pierce about his work as an editor of both poetry and nonfiction manuscripts.
I have had a little bit of editing done on some of my poems, but it's so rare. And so just hearing that a distinguished press knows that poetry, even poetry, with all the license, as you say,
or
that
maybe
the poet
even
has,
especially poetry, yeah,
right,
yeah,
needs the sensibility of an editor. And yet you're also saying that it's a different sensibility in editing that you bring to editing poetry than to the scientific or travel writing.
And the poetry, I mean, the editing I do for Copper Canyon specifically is copy editing and proofreading. I know that the manuscript is passed through many rounds before it reaches me with the author, with the editors at the staff editors at Copper Canyon, making probably more substantial or, substantive suggestions and changes. But still, when we get to the copy editing, that's really where you put some very good fine polish on what they publish.
Let's go back to that. What is an example maybe of a word that just didn't seem like the right word?
It's not necessarily word choice, although I have suggested words sometimes. It's more, I would say, the mechanics of the line. And it's not unrare for a misplaced modifier to come into poetry very easily. You have to be very careful about that because authors or poets are often striving for unusual imagery and locution, but you need to make sure that the actual words are in agreement, that sort of thing. So there's lots of, say, questions of hyphenation, questions somewhat of punctuation, questions of spelling, on and on like that. every so often, I can't think of an example right now, but, word choice does come in, especially, say, if you're checking facts, something like that. You want to make sure the spellings of just the references to historical figures, places, that kind of thing are all accurate. So you might make a suggestion in that regard.
Interesting. I think that poet's attention is usually on something else than the editor's. You had a phrase that you said, I think I heard it right, rhythms of procedures.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful phrase. Is that something other people say, or is that how you've come to describe what you see in the technical writing?
It came to my mind as I was speaking to you, so I don't know that it's not a source that I know of, but it's in the syntax that technical procedures are written in. They're very repetitive, but there also is a very precise and at times pretty eloquent rhythm to how you describe how to interact with a computer interface. And that was one of the things that struck me when I began to edit technical material, was how you could just say that over and over again in the same way, but still remain fairly engaging. And in fact, sometimes the repetition is what made, certainly it helped clarity, but it also actually brought what engagement you did have as a reader. That repetition, that clarity was really helpful. And I enjoyed actually the work as an editor to try to perfect that as best you can, because situations are a little different and you're trying to fit it into a pretty tight format. So you need a little bit of license, but you don't want to have too much.
Excellent. I love the phrase, the rhythm of procedures. What would you tell writers to think about in editing? I tell writers that they can't think about editing till they've finished.
Yeah.
Because if you start thinking with your editing brain, you start not thinking with your, what I call design mind, with the image making or the bringing forward of the tangibles and details that are going to evoke the feeling. But afterwards, you really have to distance yourself from some sort of sound that's in your ears from your writing and start to look at things the way an editor might. And so what do you think writers should do?
Editing is different from revisions, and I certainly, one of the deep practices that a writer has to adopt, in many cases is revision, and that's really more of a writing job than an editing job, although editing is not too far from revision at times. But I guess I would say mostly, as I was thinking about approaching a writer, is that editors there is not necessarily there to second guess what the writer has put down on the page. What you really want to do, or what I try to do as an editor, is make the most of what the writer has presented you. You need to, it's very difficult. That's why copy editors have proofreaders. Every time you read something, you're going to find something a little different. So I guess I would basically say there's going to be a lot of mechanical, stylistic, other things like that, aspects of writing that are going to just escape a writer as he or she is looking at content, as, they're looking at plot, character, all that sort of thing, the really higher level theme, all of that, the emotion that they want to convey as a writer, and to not necessarily leave it to the editor, but to understand that the editor is there to really be a bit of a devil's advocate, to be a bit of a model reader, to really kind of respond as someone who's going to be part of the writer's audience, and who's often going to be one of the people who reacts to the manuscript.
Well, it sounds like the editor, in your mind, is a good comrade and a good friend, and you're in good hands if you have a good editor.
Oh, I would like to think that. Certainly I can well recall the first time I wrote myself a substantial book and having it returned to me by an editor who I had worked with for a long time and who I knew to be a trusted colleague, and I was absolutely floored at how much she found, thinking that I'd turned in a perfect chapter. And after you get over the shock and perhaps even a little bit of why are they messing with my beautiful prose, you realize that, again, the editor has pointed out some really deficiencies in your own clarity, and that the best response to take is to read what the editor has said pretty seriously. And if you want to address it a little differently, that's probably your prerogative as an author. But to really not just dismiss it out of hand, because they're usually pretty well-founded comments.
I totally agree. Sometimes the writer does find a different way to fix it than the editor might suggest. On the other hand, what's important is that there was a stumble there, that the editor, as a good reader, stumbled.
Absolutely. And that's often, a lot of times, rather than make a specific suggestion for a change in line or a change in the paragraph's organization, I will simply make a comment and saying, I got here and I stumbled. And you need to, of course, then say more than I just, stumbled. You have to say why I stumbled. Why didn't it make sense to you? And you might offer a suggestion at that point as an editor, the author. But what you really want to do is point out, again, as you're saying, that as a reader, this just didn't work, and the author should bring, his or her attention back to this section or this paragraph, sentence, what have you, and think through it a little bit more.
That moment you said when you got the manuscript back and you thought I sent in a perfect chapter, and here I have all these edits suggested. It is very, very hard for a writer to completely meet the needs of a reader without an editor in there who's acting as that first, or maybe not first, but a very trusted reader. There is something about how much we know to begin with when we're writing that keeps us maybe from fully saying something. We are linear beings in a way, but we're not really, and so we don't always put our information down there in a way that a reader who has to track things in a more linear way, if that makes sense, can do it. And so there really is, I think, the need among writers to know that it's not really a reflection on their writing. It's sort of just an organic part of the process, that what you set down, no matter how well you thought you did it, is probably not perfect.
I agree with you. And, and again, that's certainly one of the pleasures of editing, is to actually get to see a manuscript more than once. You see it and you make changes, and then you see the author's response. The majority of the time, the author responds pretty friendly and with goodwill, and then other times you actually then see how you perhaps misunderstood as an editor what the author is trying to convey. So now you have to sort of integrate and incorporate that comment again and understand what your own misstep might have been, and maybe even come back and query again if now the fact that the author has clarified something changes your perspective. It's very good practice and pleasant, and that's part of the editing-writing relationship, is to get to exchange more than one draft, more than one editing round with authors. I'm working with a pair now on a Microsoft Press book who are both very knowledgeable about their subject matter, and I'm editing reasonably hard, but it's lots of fun to have them come back and just, we get to talk about paragraph, sentences, that kind of stuff. Sometimes I learn why they put it some ways, and other times I'm able to persuade them why I think this change is really helpful.
So that's the collaboration you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, and I can see the pleasure. You're smiling and your eyes are bright. The pleasure in knowing that you can work with people to create something valuable for so many other people who are going to read it. Do you ever feel like you think editors should get more attention than they do, or do you like the fact that we forget about the editor, we think about the author?
Editors get their names in the book in an appropriate way most of the time, giving them credit for the work they do. I mean, I love to hold in my hands the books that I've edited and that sort of thing, and it's nice to share them with friends, but I never want to take false credit for the outcome that's there. I mean, editors have very defined roles. They're not the authors. They're not the guiding intelligence necessarily behind a project, although sometimes they are.
Right.
Then that's the case. But I think editors get their due. I mean, it may be one of those things that oftentimes people feel isn't necessarily a trained skill, but that anyone can sort of sit down and revise something. But I guess I would argue that that's not the case, that editors really are applying a very specific knowledge. I mean, it's very attentive reading, but it's attentive reading of a kind that not everyone does day in and day out. And it's actually the application of the conventions and that sort of thing really make the difference.
I totally agree. I do developmental editing, or I'll be working with a student and I see that if you took a chunk and you put it at the end and you took a few words out, there's this beautiful meaning that comes forward that they missed. And I'll suggest it, I'll send it back. And the most gratifying things that happen are people who see that I read deeply. Their words were there. They said something they didn't even realize they said. And then when they see it, they're so amazed that I could see it. And I think that is that special kind of reading, that you're reading for a kind of meaning that's emerging from the work and sculpting it, letting it be there, honoring it. The intriguing question I'll get sometimes is this still mine? Can I publish it? No, we're talking about shorter things, not a whole book. We're talking about an essay or a vignette or a poem. And my answer is, of course. This is yours.
Yes. And
this is how it looked to me when I read it closely. This is yours. It's such an interesting moment that people would think that because an editor had a hand in reshaping or bringing out I'm thinking of my grandmother who used to speak in Yiddish and then switch to English. She would say, what I'm trying to bring out is, and then she'd turn back to Yiddish. Never knew what she was trying to bring out. Maybe that's why I like editing, so I can find out what we're trying to bring out. But the shyness that writers can have about what's theirs, what's not theirs. And also, I think an issue in editing is that in a way it's a shortcut. When you're in school and your teacher says, no, this doesn't work, it's incoherent, it's wordy, it's this or that, and then you have an editor who fixes it, you kind of may, as the studious student, feel that it's not yours because you didn't go through the pain of finding how to do it yourself. And I've abandoned that myself in my own thinking as a writer and as a helper to writers, because I think you actually learn from the shortcut. Over and over again, I have learned from editors. When they changed a sentence of mine or took one out, I learned something.
Oh, yeah. I would say that in the writing I've done, which I came to much later than my work as an editor, all the work I did as an editor really contributes a lot to the writing I do. I mean, I revise a lot, but I'm applying the editorial, I hope, the standards when I write as well, even though I always get very helpful and good edits as well.
So is the lesson that we wish our teachers were editors?
English teachers say especially I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think that teachers help in other ways because what I want teachers to do, of course, is to try to set up a framework that you can learn on best on your own and not necessarily do it for you. Sometimes an editor really has to just do something for the sake of a book and that kind of thing, or the sake of a paragraph, and really convince the author why. Teaching, I think, is a little different in that case because teaching really is hoping that you get the student to, in a structured way, but you really want to make a student go back and rethink, point out deficiencies, but even maybe say, here's how the sentence might work out better. But you really want the student then to go back and apply that in another situation so you can see that the learning synced in.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. We need both then. We need teachers, we need to structure ourselves to be learners, and we need our editors. It's been a delight to talk to you today, John, and I look forward to reading some of the books you put out, especially to the forthcoming Floating Bridge book. They come out each year, right?
They do. It'll be out in November.
All right. Well, we'll be looking for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by